We acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the Indigenous people on whose land Syracuse University now stands. May the information you glean from this podcast motivate you to uphold Indigenous values, protect Mother Earth, and honor Indigenous treaties. White supremacy is a prevalent topic in the United States. It thrashed our country in the 20th century, and now we see its more covert and ever more present influence today. But why do white supremacists feel they are on the top of the hierarchy? That's what we're going to explore by looking at the Doctrine of Discovery, or the Doctrine of Christian Discovery. Welcome to the Doctrine of Christian Discovery. I'm Tanner Randall, your host from Good Faith Media. We're producing this podcast at the Religious Origins of White Supremacy Conference in December of 2023 at Syracuse University in New York. This year is particularly special because it's the 100th anniversary of Johnson v. McIntosh, the Supreme Court proceeding that installed the framework of the Doctrine of Discovery within American government. We will be talking about the different ramifications of the Doctrine of Discovery and how it led to Indigenous values and land being stolen, as well as white supremacy and the general idea of revitalized Indigenous culture. The Doctrine of Discovery allows a certain kind of mindset. With white supremacy, it establishes the idea that there is a conqueror and a conquered. It puts the justification for people to see themselves as better than others. And in modern times, we often see that government structures are terrorized by one group deciding the social and moral implications of an entire society. So what we're going to do with our next interviewee is explore what stories we can dissect to understand the influence of the Doctrine of Discovery, or as we like to call it in this podcast, the Doctrine of Christian Discovery. We would like to thank our sponsors who made this podcast possible. Many thanks to the Henry Luce Foundation, Syracuse University, Indigenous Values Initiative, American Indian Law Alliance, American Indian Community House, Good Faith Media, Tanatierra, and Towards Our Common Public Life. We appreciate your support. I'm Tanner Randall with Good Faith Media. Our guest on this episode is Robert P. Jones. Robert is the president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute and author of The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy. I'm here with Robert P. Jones, and we are going to be discussing white supremacy and how it is interacting with the Doctrine of Discovery. Robbie, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
To start us off, I have been studying a lot about white supremacy and the Doctrine of Discovery, and white supremacy changed significantly over the last few centuries. I find it more covert, but increasingly present. Maybe that's because online forums are popular and often can perpetuate different echo chambers. But in what ways does white supremacy inflate the ideas of the Doctrine of Christian Discovery, and where do you see its influence today?
Well, as you know, my last book is called The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy. So I named it that for a reason, because I wanted to trace it back, particularly in the American context, to its inception and how does it get here on this place we call, the United States of America. And it turns out that it arrives really along with Christian explorers, right, from Europe. And it is it is embedded really in religion and the religion that they bring to it. So, one of the things that I think is not talked about that much is when Columbus comes back in 1493, not 1492, but 1493, he comes back with a mandate, right? And he gets that mandate from the King and Queen of Spain. We all kind of learned about that. But what we don't learn that much about is that he has another mandate. It's a moral mandate. He explicitly asked for it and got it from the Pope. right, from the head of the Western Christian Church at the time, and it was that moral mandate that really had the power that said basically if you were European and Christian, you had the right to occupy land, steal goods, and in the words of the doctrines and the Doctrine of Discovery, I mean, it literally says, and they're written out, from the office of the Pope, that you have the reason to do that and to submit their persons to perpetual slavery, right? That's just written out in the documents. It's very clear, not a wink, wink, nod, nod, but a very explicit mandate that Columbus brings with him. And it comes again from the Christian Church. And really, we're still struggling here in our country with that very idea, right? That with the superiority of European people and Christian religion. And that word, those terms, Christianity and civilization, show up over and over and over again in American history as the kind of justification for the entire transatlantic slave trade, the colonization of these lands, and the forced removal and genocide of indigenous peoples. So it's all right there, right, in this Doctrine of Discovery that Columbus brings with him in 1493, and that all the European powers bring with them in the wake of that.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because the roots of the Doctrine of Discovery is obviously from the Catholic Church and the Papal Bull. But we're here this weekend for this conference because of the 100th anniversary of Johnson v. McIntosh. Yeah. And that instilled it within America's constitutional framework, which I always find bizarre because we're a country founded on the idea of the separation of church and state. And so I guess I have a question for you of how does that kind of go from an idea that is used to colonize indigenous peoples to one that instills white supremacy or racial inferiority to other outgroups in the United States Constitution?
Yeah, well, it doesn't just pop up in 1823. That's the thing. I mean, it's notable that that's where it enters U.S. case law at the level of the Supreme Court. But before that, I mean, it's in our culture, right? So the whole ideas of manifest destiny, for example, I mean, that is in fact the Doctrine of Discovery, right? This right of the country to basically take over for Europeans to take over this entire landmass from ocean to ocean. That idea is again carried in this Christian doctrine of discovery, and it's also in our founding documents. I mean, people, I think, forget that if you take the Declaration of Independence, it is there, right? There is the things that the colonists are complaining about. We also forget that it is a statement of great democratic principles, but it's also a list of complaints to the King of England, and among those complaints are things that are all about white supremacy. They're complaining that the king is allowing slave rebellions among the colonies. They're complaining that the king will not let them occupy more Native American lands, and that they are at the mercy, or that they are being attacked by the merciless savages. That's in the Declaration of Independence, right? And of course, the Constitution explicitly excludes Native Americans. It explicitly just says excluding Indians not taxed, like in the document there, and also African Americans. It counts them infamously as 3/5 of a person, and then only to increase the power of the people who own them, right? To white enslavers. So it's not inconsistent at all, right? In 1823, for us to have a Supreme Court decision that John Marshall writes and relies on that same cultural understanding to kind of insert it into law. So if the further you get into history, the more you realize, this is not. Johnson v. McIntosh is no anomaly, right? It's like the inevitable legal outcome of this cultural worldview.
I find that, hard to digest sometimes is those other concepts within the Declaration of Independence, like you're saying, that they were mad the king was allowing slave rebellions or restricting their ability to encroach on indigenous land, because so much of it has to do with what we are taught in school. And I'm kind of alarmed by the fact that those weren't main points within my own curriculum. But that kind of brings me to my next point my next question in a increasingly confrontational society, how do we approach these ideas and expose them to people without those of different opinions completely shutting down? Like, how do we present that?
Well, it's really challenging. I'll start by saying I do think most people want to know the truth. And I think for my own journey, so I grew up Southern Baptist in Mississippi, right? And got very much, a very one-sided, false, mythological view of history, where, as James Baldwin put it, our ancestors were always heroes and always noble and always treated immigrants, Mexicans and Indians, and were kind to slaves and treated everyone with care and dignity. That was the mythology, and that the Civil War was the war between the states, right, and not a war fought over to protect slavery. That was the kind of history that I really grew up with. And for my own journey, coming out of that kind of evangelical Christian, really neo-Confederate world, it really was a realization that I'd been lied to. That for me, so I can speak very personally about this, and that I actually wanted to know the truth about our history, about my own family's history, and getting clear about that has been really important. And as I've spoken around the country, I've probably been, I don't know, a couple hundred, speaking things in the last few years, and many of them in churches, in predominantly white churches. And I am finding a pretty big appetite for them to say, actually, we do want to have this conversation. We do want to have this reckoning. And we don't want to just live in this kind of false world we've constructed over the century. So I think there's an appetite, and we're at a moment in this country, I think we are at a moment of historical reckoning, right? Where people are realize, okay, we've been sold a bill of goods here, and it's time for us to really, it's a kind of maturity. It's a kind of move out of a childish world of impossible innocence and the way we think about our past, and to come to more reality and a more mature way of thinking about American history. And it's really the only way we're going to find a way to live together in a pluralistic country going forward. We certainly can't do that built on a foundation of lies.
Mm-hmm. And I know you're a big stats guy, and I find it interesting, going into those churches, it must be kind of unique each time you speak to a group of people deciding, am I going to go more of a narrative storytelling route, or am I going to kind of bring in a lot more facts and things like that? So what's that balance like, and kind of what are the challenges you face with creating a unique presentation for these very diverse groups?
No, that's a great question. To PowerPoint or not to PowerPoint? Right, that is the question. Always. And sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. I think you're right, depending on the situation. But one nice thing, so I'm trained as a sociologist. So one nice thing I think that historians and sociologists have is we've got the receipts, right? So we're not just kind of alleging things or asserting things, but there's actual documentation and science, right, that we can point to. So as a sociologist, I can really point to things like, we've been talking about this, dusty 16th century or 15th century set of doctrines. Really, are they still around today? I might be a little skeptical of hearing that for the first time, that 500 years later, really that's still operative. But we did public opinion surveys at the organization I run. It's called Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, and we did a big couple of national studies last year where we asked literally about the Doctrine of Discovery, because we wanted to see, is it still with us today or not? And we asked people do you agree or disagree that the United States was designed by God to be a promised land for European Christians? We asked it straight up in those surveys, and we found out that about 30% of the country agrees with that statement. So on the one hand, if you're looking at the glass half full, by a margin of 2-1, Americans disagree and reject that idea of the Doctrine of Discovery, but there's a sizable minority, 30%, that agree with it. And then if you look at how that divides out, there are basically two groups where it's a majority, and the groups are white evangelical Protestants. That's the group I grew up in, Baptist, evangelicals, largely in the Southeast, and self-identified Republicans. Majorities of both of those groups today agree with that statement. So it is alive and well, in some of our mainstream white Christian religious groups, and in one of our two political parties, it now is the majority view. So it's very much a part of the national debates even today.
It's a complicated situation for me because the First Amendment, not, the 12th Amendment or anything like that. The First Amendment gives the freedom of religion, and it is so clear in our framework that this country is not something that is destined for evangelicals to take over and assert their dominance. And I think that there are a lot of different situations where you can see that. I know that in my own personal experience, my school system, I went to public school in Oklahoma. We saw those kinds of lessons being taught even in a public space. And, they may be transitioning out of it now, but it still is happening today. People still see the system as something to take advantage of. So my hope is that that's going to change and that there are going to be people within that system to kind of rid secular organizations of, religious practices or whatnot. But I think that, on that note of kind of talking about these isolated stories, and then you can look back to larger ones. In your book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, you talk about the Emmett Till tragedy. And that is an extremely well-known event and influential, and brought a lot of important issues to the forefront of a lot of people's minds. But you also kind of dissect another tragedy in Minnesota where 3 black men were hanged, correct? Or hung.
Right. Yeah.
But that's a relatively unknown story. And I think that when I read that for the first time, I was shocked because it's just another thing that is an example and testament to the pervasiveness of racism and how deep it runs in these places that you don't hear about as much, because everybody's like, there's racism in the South.
Yeah.
A lot of it. And it's like, well, yes, but these stories that aren't well known also occur. So can you speak a little bit about kind of what's productive about redissecting these more famous events, and then what is productive about going into these smaller, not isolated, but these smaller, relatively unknown instances?
Yeah. Well, so in the book, I write about three states, Minnesota, Oklahoma, and Mississippi, right? And in all of those settings, what I'm trying to do is hold together 2 histories that we usually, if we learn them at all, learn them separately, right? Indigenous history and the history of African Americans in those places. And so in Mississippi, I tried to kind of tell the story, as you said, it's quite famous. People around the world know the name Emmett Till. But if you had gone to Tallahatchie County in the Mississippi Delta where it happened as recently as the year 2000, there was literally nothing on the ground telling that story. No historical markers. No, you could not find anything to tell you that's where that happened, even though, again, people knew it around the world. To make it really personal, I graduated from public school. I was a valedictorian in my class. I had learned everything they asked me to learn in public school. And if you had asked me who Emmett Till was when I graduated high school, I could not have told you. And that was 1986. Right? If you had asked me who Medgar Evers was, I could not have told you. And he died. He was assassinated 9 miles from my driveway in Jackson, Mississippi, where I grew up. So I think part of it is trying to tell those stories. And the story I learned nothing about, to kind of keep it all in the Mississippi context, was the Trail of Tears, right? And the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the Creek in Mississippi. My high school mascot was the Rebels, right? As in Confederate rebels, right? We literally had a Confederate colonel who was our mascot, and the band played Dixie, and there was a Confederate flag that ran up and down the field when the football team scored a touchdown.
Oh my goodness.
That's my high school, right? I go to that's public high school. By the way, it was integrated, half black, half white, and that's the imagery at my high school. And then I went to my little Baptist college right outside of town in Clinton, Mississippi, Baptist College. What's our mascot? Choctaws, right? And who do we have as a mascot? Like cartoonish Indian chief, right, with a big exaggerated head that ran down. And what do we chant when the football team scores a touchdown? Scalp 'em, Choctaws, scalp 'em, with the little tomahawk thing going on, right? So that's the world in which I grew up, and yet I knew none of the real history around this. So all these caricatures and appropriations of this very near history to us, but without any grounding in what really happened there. And as a white Christian guy growing up, without any awareness of what role my people played, right, in those events as they played out, really not that long ago in the state. So part of what I'm trying to do in each of those state places is tell the story of kind of European Christian contact with Indigenous people and African Americans in place there, and to try to tell those two stories together, because really they are tied together. Like, just to make it really plain in Mississippi, you don't get the mass importations of enslaved labor until you get the forced removal of Indigenous people, right? You have to first move them out of the way to make that into farmland, right? And then you need enslaved labor to clear it all and turn it into farmland, right, for the benefit of Europeans. And so we have to learn to see those histories together, which we've just not done that well.
There are two things in particular I want to comment on after that. First is, I've heard stories. I know that my dad grew up and went to a high school that was, known as the Redskins, and they did similar chants to your high school. And I grew up as it being pervasive. But kind of like you said, I was also very involved in the academic community of my high school. And still, when I graduated, it was not known as the Tulsa Massacre. It was still the Tulsa Race Riot.
Yeah.
Which is a complete misnomer of that event. And so it's something to me that I kind of look back on still shocked by this effort to hide and conceal the reality. And the second thing I want to touch on is with those stories of, you're saying that your high school mascot was the Rebel and the college outside of town was the Choctaws. I think it's important to dissect those smaller instances that may not involve violence or anything like that to show how panoptic those concepts are. And for somebody, a person of color, it doesn't go away. It's always there. It's not a headline they're seeing in the news. It's something that is seen as acceptable by a large group of people. So I think it's really important that you brought that up. There are some redeeming paths to some of these tragic events. So can you speak to what that town has kind of done to reclaim their own history?
Yeah, so it's Duluth, Minnesota. I came across this story of these three African American circus workers. They were in town for a single day, were falsely accused of assaulting a white woman, rounded up and jailed on very little evidence, and then were lynched by a mob. And at the time, the crowd that gathered there numbered somewhere around 10,000 people. And at the time, that was a tenth of the population of the town of Duluth. So 1 in 10 people in town turned out to see these three men lynched. And in the aftermath of that, as happened in Tulsa after the Tulsa Race Massacre and other places of violence around the country, there's just like massive effort at forgetting that happened in the white community, and just let's bury it, let's never talk about it again, let's just move on, even though no justice was ever done there. And there was a group that got together really in Duluth, and it was actually just three people. It was a white woman, a Latino woman, and an African American man who decided, we need to tell this story, right? Because certainly the very small African American communities did not forget this story there, but we need to tell this story, and it could be a way to kind of promote healing in our city. And so they began to gather, support, and they ended up they were just going to put a plaque there at kind of where it happened, and it turns out they raised enough money that they actually created an entire plaza. It takes kind of the kind of corner. It's a beautiful place. It's kind of a brick walkway. It's got a kind of frieze of the three men with their names there, and it has all these kind of inspiring quotes against hate and for justice and unity around the plaza. And they did this quite early. They just in 2003. So this is well before the Black Lives Matter movement starts. And I think they're the first city to actually do a public memorial to the victims of lynching there in 2003. What was significant about it is that when the Black Lives Matter movement kind of launched, and many cities across the country were seeing demonstrations and people gathering, Duluth actually had a place where people knew to go. They actually just instinctively gathered at this memorial, and the police kind of knew what was going on. And it turns out in Duluth, the police chief was related to the woman who falsely accused these black men, and only came to know that story because of the work of commemoration that happened. And all of that influenced the way the police even acted in Duluth, right? And so instead of heavy-handed, ways of kind of resisting people peacefully demonstrating even if they didn't have a permit, he was like, look, I understand what's going on here. I understand the need for this. And they really kept their distance. They kept people safe, but they weren't heavy-handed about it. And I think just that little example is something, one, they had a place to go to kind of gather and to kind of talk about what was happening with George Floyd. I remember that George Floyd happened right down the road, right, in St. Paul, right? Minneapolis. So just down the road from Duluth. So this is a very local event for them, and even though it was happening nationwide. But there was kind of this space, kind of almost a sacred space they had created for racial justice in the city. And I think that paid a lot of dividends for them. And I could have written really 50 chapters, one for each state, both about the horrific racial violence, but also about efforts to mend and heal from that. And I think it's these local efforts. When I'm thinking about like what gives me hope looking in the future, it's these local efforts of people on the ground who decided, like, you know what, we can do better in our community, and we can tell the truth, and we can build a foundation for a better way forward for all of us.
Awesome. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Doctrine of Christian Discovery, recorded at the 2023 Religious Origins of White Supremacy Conference at Syracuse University in New York. This podcast is produced in collaboration between Good Faith Media, Syracuse University, and the Indigenous Values Initiative. I'm Tanner Randall for Good Faith Media. Our executive producers are Mitch Randall of Good Faith Media, Philip P. Arnold and Sandy Big Tree of the Indigenous Values Initiative, and Adam DJ Brett of Syracuse University and the American Indian Law Alliance. Our producer is Cliff Vaughn. Our editor is David Peng. Our music comes from Pond 5. Production assistance provided by the American Indian Law Alliance. To learn more, go to doctrineofdiscovery.org.